Well, good afternoon, friends. Welcome to another episode of Kahuna Reads. Today we are doing chapters 19 and 20. Once I update that up on the screen. When last we were visiting the story, the party had visited Renfield in the asylum, and Renfield was pleading, begging them to let him free, that they did not know what they were doing by making him stay. So, that's where we are when we start here. If you want to catch up on the back episodes, go to my YouTube channel, yt.kahunatheelder.com. That will take you straight to my YouTube channel. Look for the Kahuna Reads playlist, and in there you'll find all the previous episodes of Dracula. Right now, there is a poll going on as to what we will do for the next book. And in the lead right now is Frankenstein, followed closely by The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So we'll see what comes up next. But without further ado, let us get started with Chapter 19 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Chapter 19, Jonathan Harker's Journal. 1 October, 5 a.m. I went with the party to search with an easy mind, for I never saw Mina so absolutely strong and well. I am so glad that she consented to hold back and let us men do the work. Somehow it was a dread to me that she was in this fearful business at all. But now that her work is done, and that is due to her energy and brains and foresight, that the whole story is put together in such a way that every point tells, she may well feel that her part is finished, and that she can henceforth leave the rest to us. We were, I think, a little bit upset by the scene with Mr. Renfield. When we came away from his room, we were silent till we got back to the study. Then Mr. Morris said to Dr. Seward, "Say, Jack, if that man wasn't attempting a bluff, he is about the sanest lunatic I ever saw. Not sure, but I believe that he had some serious purpose. If he had, it was pretty rough on him not to get a chance." Lord Godalming and I were silent, but Dr. Van Helsing added, "Friend John, you know more of lunatics than I do, and I am glad of it, for I fear that if it had been to me to decide, I would, before that last hysterical outburst, have given him free. But we live and learn, and in our present task we must take no chance. As my friend Quincy would say, all is best as they are." Dr. Seward seemed to answer both of them in a dreamy kind of way. "I don't know, but I agree with you. If that man had been an ordinary lunatic, I would have taken my chance of trusting him. But he seems so mixed up with the Count in an indexy kind of way. I'm afraid of doing anything wrong by helping his fads. I can't forget how he prayed with almost equal fervor for a cat, and then tried to tear my throat out with his teeth. Besides, he called the Count Lord and Master, and he may want to get out to help him in some diabolical way. That horrid thing has the wolves and the rats and his own kind to help him, so I suppose he isn't above trying to use a respectable lunatic. He certainly did seem earnest, though. Only hope we have done his best. These things, in conjunction with the wild work we have it here in hand, help to unnerve a man." The professor stepped over, and laying his hand on his shoulder, said in a grave, kindly way, "Friend John, have no fear. We are trying to do our duty in a very sad and terrible case. We can only do as we deem best. What else have we to hope for, except the pity of the good God?" Lord Godalming had slipped away for a few minutes, but he had now returned. He held up a little sliver whistle as he remarked. A little silver whistle, as he remarked. "That old place may be full of rats, and if so, I've got an antidote on call." Having passed the wall, we took our way to the house, taking care to keep in the shadows of the trees on the lawn when the moonlight shone out. When we got to the porch, the professor opened his bag and took out a lot of things, which he had laid on the step, sorting them into 4 little groups, evidently one for each of us. Then he spoke. "My friends, we are going into terrible danger, and we need arms of many kinds. Our enemy is not merely spiritual. Remember that he has the strength of 20 men, and that though our necks or our windpipes are of the common kind, and therefore breakable or crushable, his are not amenable to mere strength. A stronger man, or a body of men more strong in all than him, can at certain times hold him, but yet they cannot hurt him as we can be hurt by him. We must, therefore, guard ourselves from his touch. Keep this near your heart." As he spoke, he lifted a little silver crucifix and held it out to me. I, being nearest to him, "Put these flowers around your neck." Here he handed me a wreath of withered garlic blossoms. "For other enemies more mundane, this revolver and this knife. And for aid in all, these so small electric lamps, which you can fasten to your breast. And for all, and above all, at the last, this which we must not desecrate needless." This was a portion of sacred wafer, which he put in an envelope and handed to me. Each of the others was similarly equipped. "Now," he said, "Friend John, where are the skeleton keys? If so, we can open the door, we will not need break the house by window, as before at Miss Lucy's." Dr. Seward tried one of the 2 skeleton keys, his mechanical dexterity as a surgeon standing him in good stead. Presently he got one to suit. After a little play back and forward, the bolt yielded, with a rusty clang shot back. We pressed on the door, the rusty hinges creaked, and slowly opened. It was startlingly like the image conveyed to me in Dr. Seward's diary of the opening of Miss Westenra's tomb. I fancy that the same idea seemed to strike the others, for with one accord they shrank back. The professor was the first to move forward and stepped into the open door. "In manus tuas, Domine," he said, crossing himself as he passed over the threshold. We closed the door behind us, lest, when we should have lit our lamps, we should possibly attract attention from the road. The professor carefully tried the lock, lest we might not be able to open it from within, should we be in a hurry making our exit. Then we all lit our lamps and proceeded on our search. The light from the tiny lamps fell in all sorts of odd forms, as the rays crossed each other, or the opacity of our bodies threw great shadows. I could not for my life get away from the feeling that there was someone else here among us. I suppose it was the recollection so powerfully brought home to me by the grim surroundings. Terrible experience in Transylvania. I think the feeling was common to all. I noticed that the others kept looking over their shoulders at every sound and every new shadow, just as I felt myself doing. The whole place was thick with dust. The floor was seemingly inches deep, except where there were recent footsteps, in which, on holding down my lamp, I could see marks of hobnails. The dust was caked. The walls were fluffy and heavy with dust, and in the corners were masses of spiders' webs, whereon the dust had gathered, till they looked like old tattered tags as the weight had torn them partly down. On a table in the hall was a great bunch of keys with a time-yellowed label on each. They had been used several times. On the table were several similar rents in the blanket of dust, similar to that exposed when the professor lifted them. He turned to me and said, "You know this place, Jonathan. You have copied maps of it, and you know at least more than we do. Which is the way to the chapel?" I had an idea of its direction, though on my former visit I had not been able to get admission to it. So I led the way, and after a few wrong turnings found myself opposite a low, arched oaken door, ribbed with iron bands. "This is the spot," said the professor as he turned his lamp on a small map of the house, copied from the file of my original correspondence regarding the purchase. With a little trouble we found the key on the bunch and opened the door. We were prepared for some unpleasantness, for as we were opening the door, a faint, malodorous air seemed to exhale through the gaps. But none of us ever expected such an odor as we encountered. None of the others had met the Count at all at these close quarters, and when I had seen him, he was either in the fasting stage of his existence, in his room, or when he was gloated with fresh blood, in a ruined building open to the air. But here, the place was small and close, and the long disuse had made the air stagnant and foul. There was an earthy smell, as of some dry miasma, which came through the fouler air. But as to the odor itself, which came, how shall I describe it? It was not alone that it was composed of all the ills of mortality and with the pungent, acrid smell of blood, but it seemed as though corruption had become itself corrupt. Ah, sickens me to think of it. Every breath exhaled by that monster seemed to have clung to the place and intensified its loathsomeness. Under ordinary circumstances, such a stench would have brought our enterprise to an end. But this was no ordinary case, and the high and terrible purpose in which we were involved gave us a strength which rose above merely physical considerations. After the involuntary shrinking consequent on the first nauseous whiff, we one and all set about our work as though that loathsome place were a garden of roses. We made an accurate examination of the place, the professor saying as we began, "The first thing is to see how many of the boxes are left. We must then examine every hole and corner and cranny, and see if we cannot get some clue as to what has become of the rest." A glance was sufficient to show how many remained, for the great earth chests were bulky, and there was no mistaking them. There were only 29 left out of 50. Once I got a fright for seeing Lord Godalming suddenly turn and look out of the vaulted door into the dark passage beyond. I looked too, and for an instant my heart stood still. Somewhere, looking out from the shadow, I seemed to see the highlights of the Count's evil face. The ridge of the nose, the red eyes, the red lips, the awful pallor. It was only for a moment, for, as Lord Godalming said, "I thought it was a soft face. It was only the shadows," and resumed his inquiry. I turned my lamp in the direction and stepped into the passage. There was no sign of anyone, and there were no corners, no doors, no aperture of any kind, but only the solid walls of the passage. There could be no hiding place, even for him. I took it that fear had helped imagination, and said nothing. A few minutes later I saw Morris suddenly step back from a corner, which he was examining. We all followed his movements with our eyes. Undoubtedly some nervousness was growing on us, and we saw a whole mass of phosphorescence which twinkled like stars. We all instinctively drew back. The whole place was becoming alive with rats. For a moment or two we stood appalled, all save Lord Godalming, who was seemingly prepared for such an emergency. Rushing over to the great iron-bound oaken door which Dr. Seward had described from the outside, and which I had seen myself, he turned the key in the lock, drew the huge bolts, and swung the door open. Then, taking his little silver whistle from his pocket, he blew a low, shrill call. It was answered from behind Dr. Seward's house by the yelping of dogs, and after about a minute 3 terriers came dashing round the corner of the house. Unconsciously, we'd all moved towards the door, and as we moved I noticed that the dust had been much disturbed. The boxes which had been taken out had been brought this way. Even in the minute that had elapsed, the number of the rats had vastly increased. They seemed to swarm all over the place at once, till the lamplight, shining in the moving dark bodies and glittering baleful eyes, made the place look like a bank of earth set with fireflies. The dogs dashed on, but at the threshold suddenly stopped and snarled, and then, simultaneously lifting their noses, began to howl in most lugubrious fashion. The rats were multiplying in thousands, and we moved out. Lord Godalming lifted one of his dogs and, carrying him in, placed him on the floor. The instant his feet touched the ground, he seemed to recover his courage and rushed at his natural enemies. They fled before him so fast that before he had shaken the life out of a score, the other dogs, who had by now been lifted in the same manner, had but small prey ere the whole mass had vanished. With their going, it seemed as if some evil presence had departed, for the dogs frisked about and barked merrily as they made sudden darts at their prostrate foes, and turned them over and over and tossed them in the air with vicious shakes. We all seemed to find our spirits rise, whether it was the purifying of the deadly atmosphere by the opening of the chapel door, or the relief which we experienced by finding ourselves in the open, I know not. But most certainly, the shadow of dread seemed to slip from us like a robe, and the occasion of our coming lost something of its grim significance, though we did not slacken a whit in our resolution. We closed the outer door and barred and locked it, and bringing the dogs with us, began the search of the house. We found nothing throughout, except dust in extraordinary proportions, and all untouched save for my own footsteps, which I had made my first visit. Never once did the dogs exhibit any symptom of uneasiness, and even when they had returned to the chapel, they frisked about as though they had been rabbit hunting in a summer wood. The morning was quickening in the east when we emerged from the front. Dr. Van Helsing had taken the key of the hall door from the bunch and locked the door in orthodox fashion, putting the key into his pocket when he had done. "So far," he said, "our night has been eminently successful. No harm has come to us, such as I feared might be, and yet we have ascertained how many boxes are missing. More than all do I rejoice that this, our first, and perhaps our most difficult and dangerous step, has been accomplished without bringing there into a most sweet Madam Mina, or troubling her waking or sleeping thoughts with sights and sounds and smells of horror, which she might never forget. One lesson, too, we have learned, if it be allowable to argue a particulari, that the brute beasts which are to Count's command are yet themselves not amenable to his spiritual power. For look, these rats that would come to his call, just as from his castle top he summons the wolves to your going, and to that poor mother's cry, so they come to him. They run pell-mell from the so little dogs of my friend Arthur. We have other matters before us, other dangers, other fears. That monster, he has not used his power over the brute world for the only or the last time tonight. So be it, that if that he has gone elsewhere. Good. It has given us opportunity to cry check in some ways in this chess game, which we play for the stake of human souls. And now, let us go home. The dawn is close at hand, and we have reason to be content with our first night's work. It may be ordained that we have many nights and days to follow, if full of peril. But we must go on, and from no danger shall we shrink. The house was silent when we got back, save for some poor creature who was screaming away in one of the distant wards, and a low, moaning sound from Renfield's room. The poor wretch was doubtlessly torturing himself after the manner of the insane with needless thoughts of pain. I came tiptoe into our own room and found Mina asleep, breathing so softly that I had to pull my ear down to hear it. She looks paler than usual. I hope the meeting tonight does not upset her. I'm truly thankful that she is to be left out of our future work, and even of our deliberations. It is too great a strain for a woman to bear. I did not think so at first, but I know better now. Therefore I am glad that it is settled. There may be things which would frighten her to hear, and yet to conceal them from her might be worse than to tell her, if once she suspected that there was any concealment. Henceforth our work is to be a sealed book to her, till at least such time as we can tell her that all is finished, and the earth free from a monster of the nether world. I dare say it will be difficult to keep silence after such confidence as ours. I must be resolute, and tomorrow I shall keep dark over tonight's doings, and shall refuse to speak of anything that has happened. I rest on the sofa, so as not to disturb her. 1 October. Later. I suppose it was natural that we should have overslept ourselves, for the day was a busy one, and the night had no rest at all. Even Mina must have felt its exhaustion, for though I slept till the sun was high, I was awake before her. I had to call her 2 or 3 times before she awoke. Indeed, she was so sound asleep that for a few seconds she did not recognize me, but looked at me with a sort of blank terror, as one looks who has been waked out of a bad dream. She complained a little of being tired, and I let her rest until later in the day. We now know of 21 boxes having been removed, and if it be that several were taken in any of these removals, then we may be able to trace them all. Such will, of course, immensely simplify our labor, and the sooner the matter is attended to, the better. I shall look up Thomas Snelling today. Dr. Stewart's diary. 1 October. It was towards noon when I was awakened by the professor walking into my room. He was more jolly and cheerful than usual. It is quite evident that last night's work has helped to take some of the brooding weight off his mind. After going over the adventure of the night, he suddenly said, "Your patient interests me much. May it be that with you I visit him this morning? Or if that you are too occupied, I can go alone if it may be. It is a new experience to me to find a lunatic who talk philosophy and reason so sound." I had some work to do, which pressed, so I told him that if he should go alone, I would be glad. And then I should not have to keep him waiting. So I called an attendant and gave him the necessary instructions. Before the professor left the room, I cautioned him against getting any false impression from my patient. "But," he answered, "I want him to talk of himself and of his delusion as to consuming live things. He said to Madame Mina, as I see in your diary of yesterday, that he had once had such a belief. Why do you smile, friend John?" "Excuse me," I said. "The answer is here." I laid my hand on the typewritten matter. When our sane and learned lunatic made that very statement of how he used to consume life, his mouth was actually nauseous with the flies and spiders which he had eaten just before Mrs. Harker entered the room. Van Helsing smiled in turn. "Good," he said. "Your memory is true, friend John. I should have remembered, and yet it is this very obliquity of thought and memory which makes mental disease such a fascinating study. Perhaps I may gain more knowledge out of the folly of this madman than I shall from the teaching of the most wise. Who knows?" I went on with my work, and before long was through that in hand. It seemed that the time had been very short indeed, but there was Van Helsing back in the study. "Do I interrupt?" he asked politely as he stood at the door. "Not at all," I answered. "Come in. My work is finished, and I am free. I can go with you now if you like." "It is needless. I have seen him." "Well?" I fear that he does not appraise me much. Our interview was short. When I entered his room, he was sitting on a stool in the center, with his elbows on his knees, and his face was the picture of sullen discontent. I spoke to him as cheerfully as I could, and with such a measure of respect as I could assume. He made no reply whatsoever. "Don't you know me?" I asked. His answer was not reassuring. "I know you well enough. You're the old fool Van Helsing. I wish you would take yourself and your idiotic brain theories somewhere else. Damn old thick-headed Dutchman." Not a word more would he say, but he sat in his implacable sullenness, as indifferent to me as though I had not been in the room at all. Thus departed for this time my chance of much learning from this so clever lunatic. So I shall go, if I may, and cheer myself with a few happy words with that sweet soul, Madame Mina. Friend John, it does rejoice me, unspeakable, that she is no more to be pained, no more to be worried with our terrible sins. So we shall much miss her help. It is better so. I agree with you with all my heart, I answered earnestly, for I did not want him to weaken in this matter. Mrs. Harker is better out of it. Things are quite bad enough for us, all men of the world, and who have been in many tight places in our time. But it is no place for a woman, and if she had remained in touch with the affair, it would in time infallibly have wrecked her. So Van Helsing has gone to confer with Mrs. Harker and Harker. Quincy and Art are out following up the clues as to the earth boxes. I shall finish my round of work, and we shall meet tonight. Mina Harker's Journal, 1 October. It is strange to me to be kept in the dark as I am today. After Jonathan's full confidence for so many years, to see him manifestly avoid certain matters, and those the most vital of all. This morning I slept late after the fatigues of yesterday, and though Jonathan was out late too, he was the earlier. He spoke to me before he went out, never more sweetly or tenderly. He never mentioned a word of what happened in the visit to the Count's house. And yet, he must have known how terribly anxious I was. Poor dear fellow. I suppose it must have distressed him even more than it did me. They all agreed that it was the best that I should not be drawn further into this awful work, and I acquiesced. To think that he keeps anything from me? And now I am crying like a silly fool, when I know it comes from my husband's great love and from the good wishes of those other strong men. That has done me good. Someday Jonathan will tell all, and lest it should ever be that he should think for a moment that I keep anything from him, I shall still keep my journal as usual. Then, if he has feared of my trust, I shall show it to him, with every thought of my heart put down for his dear eyes to read. I feel strangely sad and low-spirited today. I suppose it is the reaction from the terrible excitement. Last night I went to bed when the men had gone, simply because they told me to. I didn't feel sleepy, and I didn't feel full of devouring anxiety. I kept thinking over everything that has been ever since Jonathan came to see me in London, and it all seems like a horrible tragedy, with fate pressing on relentlessly to some destined end. Everything that one does seems, no matter how right it may be, to bring on the very thing which is most to be deplored. If I hadn't gone to Whitby, perhaps poor dear Lucy would be with us now. She hadn't taken to visiting the churchyard till I came. And if she hadn't come there in the daytime with me, she wouldn't have walked there in her sleep. And if she hadn't gone there at night and asleep, that monster couldn't have destroyed her as it did. Oh, why did I ever go to Whitby? They're now crying again. I wonder what has come over me today. I must hide it from Jonathan, for if he knew that I had been crying twice in one morning, I, who never cried on my own account, and whom he has never caused to shed a tear, The dear fellow would fret his heart out. I shall put a bold face on. If I do feel weepy, he shall never see it. I suppose it is one of the lessons that we poor women have to learn. I can't quite remember how I fell asleep last night. I remember hearing the sudden barking of the dogs and a lot of queer sounds, like praying on a very tumultuous scale, from Mr. Renfield's room, which is somewhere under this. And then there was silence over everything. Silence so profound that it startled me, and I got up and I looked out the window. All was dark and silent. Black shadows thrown in them by the moonlight seemingly full of a silent mystery of their own. Not a thing seemed to be stirring, but all to be grim and fixed as death or fate, so that a thin streak of white mist that crept with almost imperceptible slowness down the grass towards the house seemed to have a sentience and a vitality of its own. I think that the digression of my thoughts must have done me good. When I got back to bed, I found a lethargy creeping over me. I lay a while, but could not quite sleep, so I got out and looked out of the window again. The mist was spreading, and was now close up to the house, so that I could see it lying thick against the wall, as though it was stealing up to the windows. The poor man was more loud than ever, and though I could not distinguish a word he said, I could in some way recognize in his tone some passionate entreaty on his part. Then there was the sound of a struggle, and I knew that the attendants were dealing with him. I was so frightened I crept into bed and pulled the clothes over my head, pulling my fingers in my ears. I was not then a bit sleepy. I do not remember anything until the morning when Jonathan woke me. I think that it took me an effort and a little time to realize where I was, that it was Jonathan who was bending over me. My dream was very peculiar. It was almost typical of the way that waking thoughts become merged in or continued in dreams. I thought that I was asleep and waiting for Jonathan to come back. I was very anxious about him. I was powerless to act. My feet and my hands and my brain were weighted so that nothing could proceed at the usual pace. And so I slept uneasily and thought. Then it began to dawn upon me. The air was heavy, dank, and cold. I put back the clothes from my face and found, to my surprise, that all was dim around me. The gaslight which I had left lit for Jonathan had turned down, came only like a tiny red spark through the fog, which had evidently grown thicker and poured into the room. Then it occurred to me that I had shut the window before I had come to bed. I would have got out to make certain on the point. Some leaden lethargy seemed to chain my limbs and even my will. I lay still and endured, that was all. I closed my eyes, but could still see through my eyelids. It is wonderful what tricks our dreams play on us and how conveniently we can imagine. The mist grew thicker and thicker, and I could see now how it came in. I could see it like smoke, or with the white energy of boiling water pouring in not through the window, but through the joinings of the door. It got thicker and thicker, till it seemed as if it became concentrated into a sort of pillar of cloud in the room, through the top of which I could see the light of the gas shining like a red eye. Things began to whirl through my brain, just as the cloudy column was now whirling in the room. Through it all came the scriptural words, "A pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night." Was it indeed some such spiritual guidance that was coming to me in my sleep? But the pillar was composed of both the day and the night guiding. The fire was the red eye, which at the thought got a new fascination for me. Till, as I looked, the fire divided, and seemed to shine at me through the fog like two red eyes, such as Lucy told me of in her momentary mental wandering when, on the cliff, the dying sunlight struck the windows of St. Mary's Church. Suddenly the horror burst upon me that it was thus that Jonathan had seen those awful women growing into reality through the whirling mist and the moonlight, and in my dream I must have fainted, for all became black darkness. The last conscious effort which imagination made was to show me a livid white face bending over me out of the mist. I must be careful of such dreams, for they would unseat one's reason if they were too much of them. I would get Dr. Van Helsing or Dr. Seward to prescribe something for me which would make me sleep, only that I fear to alarm them. Such a dream at the present time would become woven into their fears for me. Tonight I shall strive hard to sleep naturally. If I do not, I shall tomorrow night get them to give me a dose of chloral. That cannot hurt me for once, and it will give me a good night's sleep. Last night tired me more than if I had not slept at all. 2 October, 10 p.m. Last night I slept, but I did not dream. I must have slept soundly, for I was not waked by Jonathan coming to bed. But the sleep has not refreshed me, for today I feel terribly weak and spiritless. I spent all day yesterday trying to read or lying down dozing. In the afternoon, Mr. Renfield asked if he might see me. Poor man. He was very gentle. When I came away, he kissed my hand and bade God bless me. Some way it affected me much. I am crying when I think of him. This is a new weakness, which I must be careful. Jonathan would be miserable if he knew I had been crying. He and the others were out until dinner time, and they all came in tired. I did what I could to brighten them up, and I suppose that the effort did me good. Forgot how tired I was. After dinner they sent me to bed, and all went off to smoke together, as they said. But I knew that they wanted to tell each other of what had occurred to each during the day. I could see from Jonathan's manner that he had something important to communicate. I was not so sleepy as I should have been. So before I went, I asked Dr. Seward to give me a little opiate of some kind, as I had not slept well the night before. He very kindly made me up a sleeping draught, which he gave to me, telling me that it would do me no harm, as it was very mild. I have taken it, and I am waiting for sleep, which still keeps aloof. I hope I have not done wrong, for as sleep begins to flirt with me, a new fear comes, that I may have been foolish in thus depriving myself of the power of waking. I might want it. Here comes sleep. Good night. Chapter 20. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 1 October evening. I found Thomas Snelling in the house at Bethnal Green, but unhappily he was not in a condition to remember anything. The very prospect of beer, which my expected coming had opened to him, had proved too much, and he had begun too early on his expectant debauch. I learned, however, from his wife, who seemed a decent poor soul, that he was the only assistant to Smollett, one of the two mates who was responsible person. So I drove off to Walworth, found Mr. Joseph Smollett at home and in his shirt sleeves taking a late tea out of a saucer. He is a decent, intelligent fellow, distinctly a good, reliable type of workman, with a headpiece of his own. He remembered all about the incident of the boxes, and from a wonderful dog's-eared notebook, which he produced from some mysterious receptacle about the seat of his trousers, and which had hieroglyphical entries in thick, half-obliterated pencil, he gave me the destinations of the boxes. There were, he said, 6 in the cartload, which he took from Carfax, and left at 197 Chickson Street, Miles End, Newtown, and another 6, which he deposited at Jamaica Lane, Bermondsey. If then the Count meant to scatter these ghastly refuges of his over London, these places were chosen at first delivery, so that later he might distribute more fully. The systematic manner in which this was done made me think that he could not mean to confine himself to 2 sides of London. He was now fixed on the far east of the northern shore, on the east of the southern shore, and on the south. The north and west were surely never meant to be left out of his diabolical scheme, let alone the city itself, the very heart of fashionable London in the south-west and west. I went back to Smollett and asked him if he could tell us if any other boxes had been taken from Carfax. He replied, "Well, governor, you've treated me some very handsome. I've given him half a sovereign. I had given him half a sovereign. I'll tell you all I know. I heard a man by the name of Bloxham say 4 nights ago in the Hare and Hounds in Pinch's Alley as how he and his mate had a rare dusty job in an old house at Purfleet. There ain't a many such jobs as this here, and I'm thinking that maybe Sam Bloxham could tell you more." I asked if he could tell me where I could find him. I told him that if he could get me the address, it would be worth another half sovereign to him. So he gulped down the rest of his tea and stood up, saying that he was going to begin the search then and there. At the door, he stopped and said, "Look here, governor. I ain't no sense in me keeping you here. I may find Sam soon, or I mayn't. But anyhow, he ain't like to be in a way to tell you much tonight. Sam is a rare one when he starts on the booze. If you can give me an envelope with a stamp on it, and put your address on it, I'll find out where Sam is to be found and post it to you tonight. But you'd better be up. Either I'm soon in the morning, or maybe you won't catch him. For Sam gets off Maine early. Never mind the booze the night before." This was all practical, so no one of the children went off with a penny to buy an envelope and a sheet of paper, and to keep the change. When she came back, I addressed the envelope and stamped it. And when Smollett had again faithfully promised to post the address when found, I took my way to home. We're on the track anyhow. I'm tired tonight, and I want sleep. Mina is fast asleep, and looks a little too pale. Her eyes look as though she had been crying. Poor dear. I've no doubt it frets her to be kept in the dark, and it may make her doubly anxious about me and the others. But it is best as it is. It is better to be disappointed and worried in such a way now, than to have her nerve broken. The doctors were quite right to insist on her being kept out of this dreadful business. I must be firm, for on me this particular burden of silence must rest. I shall not ever enter on the subject with her under any circumstances. Indeed, it may not be a hard task. After all, she herself has become reticent on the subject, and has not spoken of the Count or his doings ever since we told her of our decision. 2 October, evening. A long and trying and exciting day. By the first post I got my directed envelope with a dirty scrap of paper enclosed, on which was written with a carpenter's pencil in a sprawling hand, "Sam Bloxham, Corcoran's 4, Potter's Court, Bartle Street, Walworth. Ask for the depite." I got the letter in bed, and rose without waking Mina. She looked heavy and sleepy and pale, and far from well. I determined not to wake her, but that when I should return from this new search, I would arrange for her going back to Exeter. I think she would be happier in her own home, and with her daily tasks, to interest her than in being here amongst us, and in ignorance. I only saw Dr. Seward for a moment, and told him where I was off to, promising to come back and tell the rest so soon as I should have found out anything. I drove to Walworth, and found, with some difficulty, Potter's Court. Mr. Smollett's spelling misled me, as I asked for Potter's Court instead of Potter's Court. However, when I had found the court, I had no difficulty in discovering Corcoran's lodging house. When I asked the man who came to the door for the depite, he shook his head and said, "Won't know him. I ain't no such person here. I never heard of him in all my bloomin' days. I believe there ain't anybody of that kind living here anyways." I took out Smollett's letter, and as I read it, it seemed to me that the lesson of the spelling of the name of the court might guide me. "What are you?" I asked. "I'm the deputy," he answered. I saw at once that I was on the right track. Phonetic spelling had again misled me. A half-crown tip put the deputy's knowledge at my disposal, and I learned that Mr. Bloxham, who had slept off the remains of his beer on the previous night at Corcoran's, had left for his work at Poplar at 5 o'clock that morning. He could not tell me where the place of work was situated, but he had a vague idea that it was some kind of newfangled warehouse. And with this slender clue I had to start for Poplar. It was 12 o'clock before I got any satisfactory hint of such a building, and this I got at a coffee shop where some workmen were having dinner. One of these suggested that there was being erected across Angel Street a new cold storage building, and as this suited the condition of a newfangled warehouse, I at once drove to it. An interview with a surly gatekeeper and a surlier foreman, both of whom were appeased with coin of the realm, put me back on the track of Bloxham. He was sent for on my suggesting that I was willing to pay his day's wages to his foreman for the privilege of asking him a few questions on a private matter. He was a smart enough young fellow, though rough of speech and hearing. I promised to pay for his information, and given him an earnest. He told me that he had made 2 journeys between Carfax and a home in Piccadilly, and had taken from this house to the latter 9 great boxes, main heavy ones, and with a horse and cart hired by him for this purpose. I asked him if he could tell me the number of the home in Piccadilly, to which he replied, "Well, governor, I forgets the number, but it was only a few doors from the big white church or something of the kind. Not long built. It's a dusty old house, too. Do nothing to the dustiness of the house we took the bloomin' boxes from." "How did you get into the houses if they were both empty?" "Well, there was the old party what engaged me a-waiting in the house at Purfleet. He helped me to lift the boxes and put them in the dray. Curse me, but he was the strongest chap I ever struck. And then my old fellow with a white moustache, one that thin that you would think he couldn't throw a shudder." How this phase thrilled through me. Why, he took up his end of the boxes like they was pounds of tea. Me a puffin' and a blowin' afore I could up end mine anyhow. I'm no chicken neither. "How did you get into the house in Piccadilly?" I asked. "He was there too. They must have started off and got there before me. When I rung off the bell, he came and opened the door himself and helped me to carry the boxes in the hall." "The whole 9? "Well, yeah. There was 5 in the first load and 4 in the second. It was main dry work. I don't so well remember how I got home." I interrupted him. "Were the boxes left in the hall?" "Yeah. It was a big hall. There was nothing else in it. Made one more attempt." I made one more attempt to further matters. You didn't have a key?" "Never used no key, nor nothing. The old gent, he opened the door himself, shut it again when I drove off. I don't remember the last time, but that was a beer." "And you can't remember the number of the house?" "No, sir. You needn't have no difficulty about that. It's a iron with a stone front with a bow on it, and I steps up to the door. I know them steps having had to carry the boxes up with 3 loafers what come round to earn a copper. The old gent give them shillings, and they seeing they got so much, they wanted more. He took one of them by the shoulder and was like to throw him down the steps, till the lot of 'em went away cussing. I thought that with the description I could find the house. So having paid my friend for his information, I started off for Piccadilly. I gained a new painful experience. The Count could, it was evident, handle the earth boxes himself. If so, time was precious, for now that he had achieved a certain amount of distribution, he could, by choosing his own time, complete the task unobserved. At Piccadilly Circus, I discharged my cab and walked westward. Beyond the Junior Constitutional, I came across the house described, and it was satisfied. This was the next of the lairs arranged by Dracula. The house looked as if it had been long untenanted. The windows were encrusted with dust, and the shutters were up. All the framework was black with time, and from the iron the paint had mostly scaled away. It was evident that up to lately there had been a large notice board in front of the balcony. It had, however, been roughly torn away, the uprights of which supported it still remaining. Behind the rails of the balcony I saw that there were some loose boards, whose raw edges looked white. I would have given a good deal to have been able to see the notice board intact, as it would, perhaps, have given some clue as to the ownership of the house. I remembered my experience of the investigation and purchase of Carfax, and I could not feel that if I could find the former owner there might be some means discovered of gaining access to the house. There was at present nothing to be learned from the Piccadilly side, and nothing could be done, so I went round to the back to see if anything could be gathered from this quarter. The mews were active, the Piccadilly houses being mostly in occupation. I asked one or two of the grooms and helpers, whom I saw round, if they could tell me anything about the empty house. One of them said he had heard it had lately been taken, but he couldn't say from whom. He told me, however, that up to very lately there had been a notice board for sale up, and that perhaps Mitchell, Sons and Candy, the house agents, could tell me something, as he thought he remembered seeing the name of that firm on the board. I did not wish to seem too eager, or to let my informant know or guess too much, so thanking him in the usual manner, I strolled away. It was now growing dusk, and the autumn night was closing in, so I did not lose any time. Having learned the address of Mitchell, Sons and Candy from a directory of the Berkeley, I was soon at their office in Sackville Street. The gentleman who saw me was particularly suave in manner, but uncommunicative in equal proportion. Having once told me that the Piccadilly house, which throughout our interview he called a mansion, was sold, he considered my business as concluded. When I asked who had purchased it, he opened his eyes a thought wider, and paused for a few seconds before replying, "It is sold, sir." Pardon me," I said with equal politeness, "but I have a special reason for wishing to know who purchased it." Again he paused longer, and raised his eyebrows still more. "It is sold, sir," was again his laconic reply. "Surely," I said, you do not mind letting me know so much." "But I do mind," he answered. "The affairs of the clients are absolutely safe in the hands of Mitchell, Sons and Candy." This was manifestly a prig of the first water. There was no use arguing with him. I thought I had best meet him on his own ground, so I said, "Your clients, sir, are happy in having so resolute a guardian of their confidence. I myself am a professional man." Here I handed him my card. "In this instance, I am not prompted by curiosity. I act on the part of Lord Godalming, who wishes to know something of the property which was, he understood, lately for sale." These words would put a different complexion on affairs. He said, "I would like to oblige you if I could, Mr. Harker, and especially would I like to oblige his lordship. We once carried out a small matter of renting some chambers for him when he was the Honourable Arthur Holmwood. If you will let me have his lordship's address, I will consult the house on the subject, and will, in any case, communicate with his lordship by tonight's post. It will be a pleasure if we can so far deviate from our rules as to give the required information to his lordship." I wanted to secure a friend and not make an enemy, so I thanked him, gave the address of Dr. Seward's, and came away. It was now dark, and I was tired and hungry. I got a brief cup of tea at the Aerated Bread Company, and came down to Purfleet by the next train. I found all the others at home. Mina was looking tired and pale, but she made a gallant effort to be bright and cheerful. It wrung my heart to think that I had to keep anything from her, and so caused her inquietude. Thank God this will be the last night of her looking at our conferences, and feeling the sting of our not showing our confidence. It took all my courage to hold to the wine resolution of keeping her out of our grim task. She seems somehow more reconciled, or else the very subject seems to have become repugnant to her. for when any accidental allusion is made, she actually shudders. I am glad we made this resolution in time, as with such a feeling as this, our growing knowledge would be torture to her. I could not tell the others of the day's discovery till we were alone. So after dinner, followed by a little music to save appearances even amongst ourselves, I took Mina to her room and left her to go to bed. The dear girl was more affectionate to me than ever, and clung to me as though she would detain me. There was so much to be talked of, and I came away. Thank God, the ceasing of telling things has made no difference between us. When I came down again, I found the others all gathered round the fire in the study. In the train, I had written my diary so far and simply read it off to him, as the best means of letting them get abreast of my own information. When I had finished, Van Helsing said, "This has been a great day's work, friend Jonathan. Doubtless we are on the track of the missing boxes. If we find them all in that house, then our work is near the end. But if there be some missing, we must search until we find them. Then shall we make a final coup and hunt the wretch to his real death." We all sat silent a while, and all at once Mr. Morris spoke. "Say, how are we going to get into that house?" "We got into the other," answered Lord Godalming quickly. "But Art, this is different. We broke house at Carfax, but we had night and a wall park to protect us. It'll be a mighty different thing to commit burglary in Piccadilly, either by day or night. I confess I don't see how we are going to get in unless that agency duck can find us a key or some sort. Perhaps we shall know when you get this letter in the morning." Lord Godalming's brows contracted, and he stood up and walked about the room. By and by he stopped and said, turning from one to another of us, "Quincy's head is level. This burglary business is getting serious. We got off once all right. We have now a rare job on hand. Unless we can find the Count's key basket." As nothing could be well done before morning, and as it would be at least advisable to wait till Lord Godalming should hear from Mitchell's, we decided not to take any active step before breakfast time. For a good while we sat and smoked, discussing the matter in various lights and bearings. I took the opportunity of bringing this diary right up to the moment. I am very sleepy. I shall go to bed. Just a line. Mina sleeps soundly and her breathing is regular. Her forehead is puckered up into little wrinkles as though she thinks even in her sleep. She is still too pale, but does not look so haggard as she did this morning. Tomorrow will, I hope, mend all this. She will be herself at home, in Exeter. Oh, but I am sleepy. Dr. Seward's diary. 1 October. I am puzzled about Renfield. His moods change so rapidly that I find it difficult to keep touch of them, as they always mean something more than his own well-being. They form a more interesting study. This morning, when I went to see him after his repulse of Van Helsing, his manner was that of a man commanding destiny. He was, in fact, commanding destiny, subjectively. He did not really care for any of the things of mere earth. He was in the clouds, and looked down on all the weaknesses and wants of us poor mortals. I thought I would improve the occasion and learn something, so I asked him, "What about the flies these times?" He smiled on me in quite a superior sort of way, with such a smile as would have become the face of Malvolio, as he answered me, "The fly, my dear sir, has one striking feature. Its wings are typical of the aerial powers of the psychic faculties. The ancients did well when they typified the soul as a butterfly." I thought I was pushing this analogy to its utmost logically, so I said quickly, "Oh, is it a soul you're after now, is it?" His madness foiled his reason, and a puzzled look spread over his face as, shaking his head with a decision which I had but seldom seen in him, he said, "Oh, no, no, no. I want no souls. Life is all I want." Here he brightened up. "I am pretty indifferent about it at present. Life is all right. I have all I want." "You must get a new patient, Doctor, if you wish to study Zoophagy. This puzzled me a little, so I drew him on. Then you command life. You're a god, I suppose. He smiled with an ineffably benign superiority. Oh, no. Far be it from me to arrogate to myself the attributes of the deity. I am not even concerned in his especially spiritual doings. If I may state my intellectual position, I am, so far as concerns things purely terrestrial, somewhat in the position which Enoch occupied spiritually. This was a poser to me. I could not at the moment recall Enoch's appositeness. So I had to ask a simple question, though I felt that by doing so I was lowering myself in the eyes of the lunatic. And why with Enoch? Because he walked with God. I could not see the analogy, but did not like to admit it, so I harked back to what he had denied. So you don't care about life, and you don't want souls. Why not? I put my question quickly and somewhat sternly, on purpose to disconcert him. The effort succeeded. For an instant, he unconsciously relapsed to his old servile manner, bent low before me, and actually fawned upon me as he replied, I don't want souls. Indeed, I don't. I couldn't use them if I had them. There would be no manner of use to me. I couldn't eat them, or... He suddenly stopped, and the old cunning look spread over his face like a windsweep on the surface of the water. And, Doctor, as to life, what is it after all? When you've got all that you require, and you know that you will never want, that is all. I have friends, good friends like you, Dr. Seward. This was said with a leer of unexpressible cunning. I know that I shall never lack the means of life. I think that through the cloudiness of his insanity he saw some antagonism in me, for he had once fell back on the last refuge of such as he, a dogged silence. After a time I saw that for the present it was useless to speak to him. He was sulky, so I came away. Later in the day he sent for me. Ordinarily I would not have come without special reason, but just at present I am so interested in him that I would gladly make an effort. Besides, I am glad to hear anything to pass the time. Harker is out, following up clues, and so are Lord Godalming and Quincy. Van Helsing sits up in my study poring over the record prepared by the Harkers. He seems to think that by accurate knowledge of all the details, he will light upon some clue. He does not wish to be disturbed in the work without cause. I would have taken him with me to see the patient, only I thought that after his last repulse, he might not care to go again. And there was another reason. Renfield might not speak so freely before a third person as when he and I were alone. I found him sitting out in the middle of the floor on a stool, a pose which is generally indicative of some mental energy on his part. When I came in, he said at once, as though the question had been waiting on his lips, "What about souls?" It was evident that my surmise had been correct. Unconscious cerebration was doing its work even with the lunatic. I determined to have the matter out. "What about them yourself?" He did not reply for a moment, but looked all round him, and up and down, as though he expected to find some inspiration for answers. "I don't want any souls," he said in a feeble, apologetic way. The matter seemed preying on his mind, so I determined to use it, to be cool only to be kind. So I said, "You like life, and you want life." "Oh, yes, but that is all right. You needn't worry about that." "But," I asked, "how are we to get the life without getting the soul also?" This seemed to puzzle him, so I followed it up. "A nice time you'll have sometime when you're flying out there, with the souls of thousands of flies and spiders and birds and cats buzzing and twittering and meowing all around you. You've got their lives, you know, and you must put up with their souls." Something seemed to affect his imagination, for he put his fingers to his ears and shut his eyes, screwing them up tightly just as a small boy does when his face is being soaped. There was something pathetic in it that touched me. It also gave me a lesson, for it seemed that before he was a child, only a child. Though the features were worn and the stubble on the jaws was white. It was evident that he was undergoing some process of mental disturbance, and knowing how his past moods had interpreted things seemed seemingly foreign to himself. Thought I would enter into his mind as well as I could and go with him. The first step was to restore confidence, so I asked him, speaking pretty loud so that he would hear me through his closed ears, "Would you like some sugar to get your flies round again?" He seemed to wake up all at once and shook his head. With a laugh, he replied, "Not much. Flies are poor things, after all." After a pause, he added, "But I don't want their souls buzzing around me all the same." "Or spiders," I went on. "Blow spiders. What's the use of spiders? There isn't anything in them to eat, or—" He stopped suddenly as though reminded of a forbidden topic. So, I thought to myself. This is the second time he has suddenly stopped at the word drink. What does it mean? Renfield seemed himself aware of having made a lapse, so I hurried on, as though to distract my attention from it. "I don't take any stock at all in such matters. Rats and mice and such small deer, as Shakespeare has it, chicken feed of the larder, they might be called. I'm past all of that nonsense. You might as well ask a man to eat molecules with a pair of chopsticks as to try to interest me about the lesser carnivora, whom I know what is before me." "I see," I said. "You want big things that you can make your teeth meet in. How would you like to breakfast on elephant?" "What ridiculous nonsense you are talking!" He was getting too wide awake, so I thought I would press him hard. "I wonder," I said reflectively, "what an elephant's soul is like." The effect I desired was obtained, for he all at once fell from his high horse and became a child again. "I don't want an elephant's soul, or any soul at all." For a few moments he sat despondently. Suddenly he jumped to his feet with his eyes blazing and all the signs of intense cerebral excitement. "To hell with you and your souls!" he shouted. "Why do you plague me about souls? Haven't I got enough to worry and pain and distract me already without thinking of souls?" He looked so hostile that I thought he was in for another homicidal fit. So I looked in. Homicidal fit. So I blew my whistle. The instant, however, that I did so, he became calm and said apologetically, "Forgive me, Doctor. I forgot myself. You do not need any help. I am so worried in my mind that I am apt to be irritable. If you only knew the problems I have to face and that I am working out, you would pity and tolerate and pardon me. Pray do not put me in a strait waistcoat. I want to think, and I cannot think freely when my body is confined. I am sure you will understand." He had evidently self-control, so when the attendants came, I told them not to mind, and they withdrew. Renfield watched them go. When the door was closed, he said, with considerable dignity and sweetness, "Dr. Seward, you have been very considerate towards me. Believe me that I am very grateful to you." I thought it well to leave him in this mood, so I came away. There is certainly something to ponder over this man's state. Several points seem to make what the American interviewer calls a story, if one could only get them in proper order. Here they are. Will not mention drinking. Fears the thought of being burdened with the soul of anything. Has no dread of wanting life in the future. Despises the meaner forms of life altogether, though he dreads being haunted by their souls. Logically, all these things point one way. He has assurance of some kind that he will acquire some higher life. He dreads the consequence, the burden of a soul. Then it is a human life he looks to. And the assurance? Merciful God, the Count has been to him, and there is some new scheme of terror afoot. Later. I went after my round to Van Helsing and told him my suspicion. He grew very grave, and after thinking the matter over for a while, asked me to take him to Renfield. I did so. As we came to the door, we heard the lunatic within singing gaily, as he used to do in the time which now seems so long ago. When we entered, we saw with amazement that he had spread out his sugar as of old. The flies, lethargic with the autumn, were beginning to buzz into the room. We tried to make him talk of the subject of our previous conversation, but he would not attend. He went on with his singing, just as though we had not been present. He had got a scrap of paper and was folding it into a notebook. We had to come away as ignorant as we went in. He's a curious case indeed. We must watch him tonight. Letter, Mitchell, Sons, and Candy. To Lord Godalming. 1 October. Mr. Lord, we are at all times only too happy to meet your wishes. We beg, with regard to the desire of your lordship expressed by Mr. Harker on your behalf, to supply the following information concerning the sale and purchase of number 347 Piccadilly. The original vendors are the executors of the late Mr. Archibald Winter Suffield. The purchaser is a foreign nobleman, Count de Ville, who effected the purchase himself, paying the purchase money in notes over the counter, if your lordship will pardon us on using so vulgar an expression. Beyond this, we know nothing whatever of him. We are, my lord, your lordship's humble servants, Mitchell, Sons, and Candy. Dr. Seward's Diary. 2 October. I placed a man in the corridor last night and told him to make an accurate note of any sound he might hear from Renfield's room, and gave him instructions that if there should be anything strange, he was to call me. After dinner, when we had all gathered round the fire in the study, Mrs. Harker having gone to bed, we discussed the attempts and discoveries of the day. Harker was the only one who had any result, and we are in great hopes that his clue may be an important one. Before going to bed, I went round to the patient's room and looked in through the observation trap. He was sleeping soundly, and his heart rose and fell with regular respiration. This morning the man on duty reported to me that a little after midnight he was restless and kept saying his prayers somewhat loudly. I asked him if that was all. He replied that was all he heard. There was something about his manner so suspicious that I asked him point blank if he had been asleep. He denied sleep, but admitted to having dozed for a while. It's too bad that men cannot be trusted unless they are watched. Today Harker is out following up on his clue, and Art and Quincy are looking after horses. Godalming thinks that it would be well to have horses always in readiness. But when we get the information which we seek, there will be no time to lose. We must sterilize all the imported earth between sunrise and sunset. We shall thus catch the Count at his weakest and without refuge to fly to. Van Helsing is off to the British Museum looking up some authorities on an ancient medicine. The old physicians took account of things which their followers do not accept, and the professor is searching for witch and demon cures, which may be useful to us later. I sometimes think we all must be mad, and we shall wake to sanity in straight waistcoats. Later. We have met again. We seem at last to be on the track, and our work of tomorrow may be the beginning of the end. I wonder if Renfield's quiet has anything to do with this. His moods have so followed the doings of the Count that the coming destruction of the monster may be carried to him in some subtle way. If we could only get some hint as to what passed in his mind between the time of my argument with him today and the resumption of fly-catching, it might afford a valuable clue. He is now seemingly quiet for a spell. Is he? That wild yell seemed to come from across his room. The attendant came bursting into my room and told me that Renfield had somehow met with some accident. He had heard him yell, and when he went to him, found him lying on his face in blood, on the floor, covered in blood. I must go. Once. And that, my friends, concludes Chapter 20 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, I hope you're enjoying this. If you are, great. I'll be back here next Thursday at the same time to read another chapter, another 2 chapters. We are approaching the end. There are, I believe, 28 chapters. Let me verify here. I thought there were 28. Perhaps not. Yeah, I think it's 28 chapters. I'll have to look. So we're not far from the end here. Maybe, let's see, if I do a page count. We're at 293, and it ends right around page 400. So about 100 pages away. So we're probably 3/4 of the way through the book. Again, I'll be back here next week, same time, 4 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern time, and midnight British Standard Time. With next week will be chapters 21 and 22. If you missed any of the previous chapters, you can go to my YouTube page, yt.kahunatheelder.com. Look for the Kahuna Reads playlist, and you'll see them all there. You can catch them right from the beginning. While you're there, if you like what I'm doing, if you like this presentation, think about subscribing. And then click the little bell button. Make sure you're notified when the next one goes live so you don't miss any of them. You can also catch me, on Twitch most mornings. Weekday mornings, about 8 o'clock Pacific time. That's 11 o'clock Eastern time and 4 o'clock in the afternoon British Standard Time. And, again, if you're enjoying it, hearing it live, think about subscribing. Make sure you're following. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great weekend and a great week. I will see you then. And if not, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Have a great day, you guys. Bye-bye now.